at the end. Well, I'll save that till the end. All right, so 1 Samuel 17, we've been introduced to Goliath. We know that the Israelites at this point, they're afraid of Goliath. Saul as well is afraid of Goliath. We go back to 1 Samuel 17, verse 11. David, we are introduced to how David meets Goliath, and that's because Jesse tells David to go take provisions of food to his brethren who are there on the front lines fighting. David does so. He goes and he sees they're not at the camp. He leaves the camp to meet them as they're marching to face the Philistines. That's where David hears Goliath make the challenge that he had been doing twice a day for 40 days and 40 nights. At that point, David, is certainly maybe questioning in his mind, why has no one gone out to meet the challenge of Goliath? And you get an indication of that. We talked about how Eliab, David's older brother, was upset because he thought David was sort of trying to take the spotlight. He makes charges of arrogance and pride and unresponsibility. But we're going to point out that wasn't the case at all. But David's very confident, right? And that's what's contrasted, the lack of confidence from the Israelite army versus David's confidence. And so when gets back to Saul that there's this guy going around talking to camp saying he's going to be willing to go and take on Saul. Or willing to take on Goliath. And so Saul calls forth David to meet with him. And we know, based on chapter 16, David and Saul have met in some capacity before, because he's the armor bearer and he plays music to soothe Saul's mental state. So David comes to Saul. Saul looks at David and certainly, again, pointed out in verse 33, simply that, David, you're not able to go up against him. And the comparison that he made there was, again, David is a youth, not necessarily in the sense that he's a little kid, but talking about experience, right? Goliath has already been talked about as this champion, a man who is successful in the field. He's done this for a good while, is the idea. David has no experience with that. Saul says, essentially, this won't work. David, you don't have enough experience to hope to fight against Saul. And so what example does David then use to show to Saul that he is willing, not just willing, but he will be able to defeat Saul in battle?
He killed a lion and a bear that attacked his father's flock.
Yeah, David just talks about what his work was as a shepherd, right? We think about a shepherd, he guides sheep, he tends to it. Sometimes that requires a shepherd to use violence to protect the sheep. And in this case, it was a bear and a lion. And David simply says he went out, took them by the throat, and slew both of those animals, which again gives us the idea that David's not a young kid. And so by verse 36, David just simply says that the same person, myself, who took down the lion, who took down the bear, there's no doubt about it that God was with me in those instances, and in that light, God is with me to take down this Philistine, which is where his confidence comes from. And so Saul says, okay, David, you can go ahead and go, which is at the end of verse 37. And so now Saul is going to try to help prepare David for battle. Now, it is interesting to note here about this, that David has used an example of being a shepherd for what he was entrusted with, right? He was entrusted with his father's flock. David used that example as a shepherd to simply illustrate his ability to defend the Israelites. If you think about who Saul is, right? We know that Saul was called the captain. He was not the owner of God's people, but his responsibility was to, in a sense, be the steward of God's people. And in this way, David, and we'll note this as we continue to go forward, David is really acting like the type of person that Saul was commissioned to be by God, because Saul had a responsibility to protect God's people. But now David is going to take on that role because Saul is unwilling to act. All right, so David puts on Saul's armor. Let's look at verses 38 and 39. All right, and Saul armed David with his armor, and he put a helmet of brass upon his head. Also he armed him with a coat of mail. And David girded his sword upon his armor, and he essayed to go, for he had not proved it. And David said unto Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not proved them. And David put them off him. So when you think about Saul's armor, it's important to keep in mind what we have talked about in 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 22. Important verse to tie in here, because in that chapter we talked about how the Philistines were known for making armor and iron and things of that nature. 1 Samuel chapter 13, verse 22 is very specific that at least at this point, Saul and his son Jonathan were the only two people that had armor like what the Philistines probably had in all of Israel. Right? And that's important to keep in mind with this verse. Again, there are similarities to it, right? We see that he put on a helmet of brass upon his head. If you go back earlier in chapter 17, Goliath had the same thing. We talked about that being a helmet overlaid with brass, probably on the inside. It had animal skins to sort of provide a cushion for the head. But the important point is that the armor is very similar to Saul's. Now, based on 1 Samuel 13, verse 22, this is very important to how we understand what happens here, right? David puts on Saul's helmet, puts on the coat of mail. We're told that this is possibly an extra set that Saul had brought with him that might have been outfitted for him, but nevertheless was his to begin with. But if we look back at 1 Samuel 13, verse 22, this is probably the first time that David has worn any type of armor like this before, because 1 Samuel 13, 22, only Saul and his son Jonathan had the type of armor that the Philistines did. So when we read here in verses 38 through 39, we think about this in the case of, the armor is just simply too big for David to wear, which is probably true because Saul was said to stand well above his companions within his own tribe. That's true. That's certainly true. But also in conjunction with that, David probably had not worn armor like this before. And so he's probably, having never worn it before, he's probably not used to how it slows your movement. Probably not used to how it slows you down because it's weighted, obviously, and very heavy, as we've talked about before. And so that's important to keep in mind. We'll move on from there. So again, David puts it on. We do note that in 1 Samuel 16:21, David is said to be the armor bearer for Saul, but more than likely he may not have worn armor like this before. He was just simply tasked with keeping in charge of it. You think about if you're in David's position, maybe you very rarely have seen armor like this before. The temptation would be to try it on, to put it on. An example for me would be if I was, for whatever reason, supposed to take care of Peyton Manning's jersey in uniform. Whenever he wore it, I know as a kid, I would have had the temptation to put on the jersey, to put on the pants, to suit up like Peyton Manning does, because that's somebody that I admired. Maybe David had that temptation. Maybe, possibly David might have been in that same predicament. But either way, David was the armor bearer, but more than likely probably had never worn armor like this before, which helps explains why as he goes, and it says as he essayed or attempted to go, he had not proved it. And that way he could not function with it. And David makes that point to Saul. I'm not going to be capable of fighting with Goliath. You think in Saul's mind here, what he's doing with David is simply outfitting David to fight against Goliath the way that he expected, right? To go in and hand-to-hand combat with a sword to take on Goliath. That was Saul's expectations here because of the armor that was given. But again, Saul is one that we've talked about that thought a lot of times about the physical concerns rather than spiritual concerns, right? And that's the polar opposite of who David is. So David simply says, I'm not going to be able to wear this armor at all. By the end, verse 39, he takes it off of him. So verse 40 says that he took his staff in his hand, chose him 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in a shepherd's bag, which he had, even in a scrip, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. All right, so looking at the weaponry that David decides to take, right, doesn't take the armor, doesn't take the sword. It says that he took a staff in his hand. Certainly, David acted as a shepherd to protect his sheep. This is something that he would have been comfortable with. A staff, we're told that a staff had an end that was supposed to be able to hook onto a sheep's around its neck to be able to guide it, but it was often said that the other end of it was pointed and in that way was supposed to be used as something to prevent something to attack a sheep, so it can be used as a weapon. And that's very, very interesting too, because we talked about, David acting in a way as the shepherd of God's people because he's going to go up from them. And so David, when he presents himself in front of Goliath, David looks like a shepherd. And we'll know more about that in a moment, but I think that is very, interesting to think about. David's going to Goliath not as a warrior, not like Eliab might have suggested earlier, where in his mind, maybe David's going forth to get glory for himself. That's not what a shepherd does. Shepherd's job is to take care of his sheep. That's the ultimate goal. A warrior's job might be for personal glory. That's not who David is. And it's very interesting to note, verse 40, that David presents himself before Goliath not as a warrior like him, but as simply the shepherd, in a way, of God's people. You note again, he took 5 smooth stones out of the brook. Why do you think he chose smooth stones? Why do you think that might be important here?
They travel better than, I don't know.
One thing we're told about smooth stones, at least from what I've read, generally it would be thought that a smooth stone was more accurate. If you think about if it's, if you think about a football, for instance, if it travels frontward, right, where the two ends are pointed like that, generally going to be pretty more accurate. But if it's thrown like this, where the ends are pointed to the side, the wind's going to pick it. It's going to spin around. It's not like a baseball. You can grip a baseball any way, and generally you can throw it pretty accurately. And I know you can throw curveballs and things like that. But a smooth stone in this case would just be something that's more accurate. And I thought that was, I always wondered, why does it make the point about 5 smooth stones? We're just told that they're more accurate. He puts them in a shepherd's bag, and he takes a sling with him, and he draws near to the Philistines. One thing that we know about slings is that they were old by the time that David was around. We're told that the Egyptians, about 1,000 years earlier, is about the first evidence that we have of somebody using a sling in warfare. And that goes about back to 1,000 years before David's time. In Sennacherib's palace, who was the king of the Assyrians during the days of Hezekiah, there is part of his palace, part of the archaeological evidence there that has been uncovered, is a group of I think they're tablets or something of that nature. They're called the Lachish Release. And you see Assyrian soldiers who are wearing armor using slings as a weaponry. And we're going to, a little bit later on, we're going to look at an example of that. But slings were a very effective way of fighting for somebody that did not have the armor like the Philistines did. In fact, we are told that there was a specific tribe of Israel that was said to have many accurate slingshot throwers. Do we remember what that tribe was? Yeah, it was Benjamin. Judges 20 verse 6 talks about that there were 700 left-handed slingers that were very accurate. Could get within a hair. Down to the hair is what the Bible describes there. David, though, is not from Benjamin, but he's certainly as a shepherd used that before. And we've made this point before, but if we think about this as a point of application, simply that, when we look at all of this, sometimes the temptations, if we think about ourselves in light of this, we obviously fight against as Ephesians chapter 6 talks about, we fight against, you know, spiritual wickedness, sin, things of that nature. You know, sometimes we might have the tendency to sort of fight like the world does. And sometimes the world doesn't fight fair, doesn't fight honorably, doesn't, you know, there's a temptation, if you just put this as an example, right? If you are talked about very poorly among your companions, somebody spreads a lot of rumors about you, and they can be completely unfounded. What's the natural reaction to do in that situation?
Do the same to them.
Yeah, do the same to them. The natural thing to do is to go into talk very bad about them in the workplace or, you know, wherever the case may be. That would be fighting like the world does. Sometimes our best way of fighting is not like what the world does. And in that's one particular example of that, right? As Matthew chapter 5 talks about, right? We bless our enemies. We don't retaliate in that sense. And that's a point of application. David understood, you know, if God's on my side, I don't have to worry about fighting like Goliath does. And so not being able to wear this armor, that shouldn't make me ashamed. That shouldn't make me afraid about what's about to happen. Because if I have God on my side and I fight relying on Him, I'm going to be successful in the end. Same point is true with us, with our personal battle with sin, certainly with other forms of sin that we experience, right? We fight according to what God has set forth. All right, so verses 41 through 51, sort of the next section we're going to try to get through in the remaining time that we have. So David leaves Saul's presence. He comes near to the Philistine, verse 41. The Philistine came on and drew near unto David, and the man that bare the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy, and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog, that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, and to the beasts of the field. Now, one thing that you want to note about this section, what is sort of contrasted, it doesn't come out directly, but what is contrasted here is not just David's faith in God versus Goliath's disdain for God, but also the quickness of David's actions versus the slowness of of Goliath's actions. You know, verse 39, how many verbs are given there, right? He girded his sword upon his armor. He essayed to go. Verse 40, he took his staff in his hand, chose him 5 smooth stones. And you see the verbs there. And how many actions are sort of compiled by David in verses 39 through 40. Verses 41 through 45, a lot of what Goliath does, the Philistine, his actions are sort of drawn out. And so when we talk about when David finally kills Goliath, that is, in a way, how David beats Goliath, obviously relying on God's help. Because he uses a sling, it's a lot quicker than Goliath, who's bigger and would have been slower, a little bit slower in terms of his movement. But that's something to think about as you look through that section. Again, we read about Goliath, verse 41, that he has a man that goes before him bearing a shield. And we've talked about this before, but the shield bearer, his job was simply to... part of it was an honor to Goliath to be presented with a shield bearer. Generally, common soldiers had to carry their own shields. But in this case, Goliath has someone to carry it for him. We're told that shield bearers would have protected Goliath, in this case, from somebody shooting an arrow or slinging a stone. And we'll talk more about what happened to the shield bearer in a moment and why David was successful. He's also said that the shield bearer would point out the direction of an enemy that was approaching. And so the shield bearer sees David coming, maybe reiterates that back to Goliath. And verse 42, Goliath, it says that he looked about. And you can almost picture him sort of looking for a really tall man, and then sort of as a way to show disrespect to David, he sort of looks down and is like, oh, there you are. And the image here is that Goliath is really... it says disdain, but think about the idea of mocking or making fun of David. And we've mentioned this before, but when this sort of event happened, when somebody chose to fight against Goliath, Both armies were there present to watch what happened. And that becomes clear, as we'll talk about next week, the reaction after David kills Goliath. But both armies are there. They see what's happening, and you would think that not only Goliath shows disdain, but the other Philistines that see this shepherd come and approach to take on Goliath, they probably think this is hilarious. They probably think this is a joke by the Israelites. That's certainly what Goliath thought. He had disdain for him. Again, the idea of disdain is belittle, to mock. Goliath is certainly showing here a confidence in himself, and at least in Goliath's mind, he has a right to think bad about him. Again, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. Verse 42. If you've got another translation, what does the word ruddy mean? If I'm not mistaken, the word ruddy also means red in a sense. Just the idea, verse 42, Goliath sees David, and we might could say that he looks at David and sees that David doesn't have battle scars, doesn't have signs that he's ever been in a fight before with another man. And so Goliath sees this man come before him. He's dressed like a shepherd, doesn't show any sign of ever having any experience in fighting. And so Goliath, thinking to himself, well, this is a joke. Verse 43, Goliath, in a sense, feels insulted by this, right? Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? Again, anytime you call somebody a dog, at least in this time, that was a great insult. First and Second Samuel see on several occasions where it's used as an insult. There's a little bit of an irony here too, right? Because we know in the New Testament on a few occasions that the Jews often thought about the Gentiles as dogs, right? Because they weren't circumcised. They weren't a part of the covenant. And Goliath is obviously a Gentile. David is a Jew. And so there's a little bit of an irony there with it. So he sees David come to him. Goliath notes that he has staves with him. What is another word there for staves? Sticks. No doubt this is going to be a reference to David's what? Staff, right? The shepherd's rod that he has. And that's what the staves are. What do you see not mentioned here? Stones. You don't see stones mentioned here. What else do you not see Goliath specifically mentioned in verse 43? Yeah, you don't see a mention of a sling or stones. Perhaps David had that. I know it says in verse 40 that the sling was in his hand. Perhaps he had that concealed a little bit. Maybe that's why Goliath felt so overconfident, because with the way we've talked about the way that his armor was laid out, really the only weakness that he had was his face. Slingshot, maybe he did and he just didn't want to note it, but I think it is interesting here that Goliath does not note the sling or the stones. Perhaps David had that hidden from Goliath. And so David had that advantage there. So the Philistine cursed David by his gods. This is not going to be a reference to the gods of Israel. Generally, a soldier or a person would curse or bless something by his own gods. Certainly we've talked about, as was the case with Goliath, that we talked about the god Dagon before, and we've noted a couple of who the Philistines' gods would be. I want Andrew, I think I had Andrew. Andrew, if you would, read for us Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 26 through 29.
See, I am sitting before you today, a blessing and a curse. The blessing, if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you today, and the curse, if you do not obey the commandments of the Lord your God, turn aside from the way that I am commanding you today, to go after other gods that you have not known. And when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to take possession of it, you shall set the blessing on Mount Gerizim and the curse on Mount Ebal.
All right, so in Deuteronomy chapter 11, the passage that Andrew has read for us, that passage is where Moses, and I know Moses is a spokesperson for God, but generally, in order to curse or bless somebody, you invoke the name of your gods. And so Moses did that in Deuteronomy chapter 11 by talking about blessings and cursings. And you see that fulfilled, I believe, in Joshua chapter 8 when they come to Mount Gerizim and Ebal. But when Goliath curses David by his gods, he is cursing David, but he's invoking the power of his own gods, right? He's not just saying that Goliath is challenging David, but Goliath's gods are going to help deliver him. That was the importance there of noting that. And so David is obviously going to respond by saying, my God is better than your gods in the following verses. And then Goliath simply notes verse 44, David's fate there. If you come to me, I will give thy flesh into the fowls of the air and to the beasts of the field. That phrase there is obviously a common thing in the Old Testament to refer to destruction. And we're told that generally if you not having a burial in some cases was seen as worse than death from the perspective of someone's honor. I want Jameson to read for us Jeremiah chapter 8 verses 1 and 2.
At that time, says the Lord, they shall bring out the bones of the kings of Judah, and the bones of the princes, and the bones of the priests, and the bones of the prophets, and the bones of the inhabitants of Jerusalem out of their graves. They shall spread them before the sun and the moon, and all the host of heaven, which they have loved, and which they have served, and after which they have walked, which they have sought, and which they have worshipped. They shall not be gathered nor buried. They shall be like refuse on the face of the earth.
So in Jeremiah chapter 8, the reference is there talking about the coming Babylonian captivity. You know, obviously death through captivity is and being taken away as slaves. That's something that's very negative. But one of the punishments that is mentioned there that's prophesied about is the idea of taking up the dead bodies of kings, taking up their bones and scattering them across, because that was seen as a great insult to a people. And so Goliath simply says, you know, it's not like you're just going to die, but your body, your carcass is going to be given to the fowls of the air. It's going to be given to the beasts of the field. That was sort of seen as a dishonorable way of ending up. You know, we understand that, you know, if we die, you know, that's what you generally want, a proper burial. But to not have a proper burial was sort of seen as a sign of great disgrace. And that's what Goliath simply says is going to happen to David. You're going to die a disgraceful death. What other Old Testament character did not receive a proper burial? In fact, she fell out of a window. Jezebel, right? She fell out of a window, and it said that the dogs went and licked up the blood, ate the carcass. That was a dishonorable way of dying. So that's what Goliath has said to David. David simply responds in verses 45 to 48, that will not be the case. Here's a question I want you to think about for a moment. In the story of David and Goliath, who was the underdog? In the story of David and Goliath, who was the underdog in this account? Goliath, right? We think about when it comes to David and Goliath, when we talk about using that in the sporting world or in any type of competition, we think about the story, we think about David and Goliath, we typically call the underdog David, do we not? Generally, I think we do. But what's interesting to note here, you know, we use that in that way over and over again, but David is simply going to say he's not the underdog here, right? It's actually Goliath who is the underdog, and I think that is interesting to note how we use that phrase versus what David thought of himself with the power of God on his side. Verse 45, David comes to the Philistine, thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield, but I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee, and take thine head from thee, and I will give thee the carcass of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that the Lord saveth not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. David simply responds, my weapons are better. Goliath's confidence came from the weaponry, from his stature. From his experience, David's confidence was simply put in God. The Israelites lacked confidence because their faith was not in God. It was in the potential of what Goliath could do. But David simply responds in these passages that through God's help, I'm going to be able to defeat you in battle. One thing I'll point out, verse 45, it says, "Thou comest to me with a sword and with a spear and with a shield." The word there for shield is not necessarily the same as what the shield bearer carried in front of Goliath. That word there, shield, it can be translated as javelin. We've talked about that before, but that's what Goliath wore around his body that would have protected his neck from being attacked with a sword. And we'll note, we may have to wait till next week to note the importance of that. Again, Goliath notes that, you've not just insulted us, but you've also obviously insulted God as well. David makes reference to the Lord of Hosts. And we've talked about this before. Lord of Hosts is a military term. It just simply describes God's overpowering military presence, his ability to win any battle that he encounters, or his ability to help his people win battles that they encounter. And so God is essentially going to deliver me into your hand. His body is actually going to receive a dishonorable fate, not be buried. And we'll see that more in a moment next week. In verse 47, very important, simply put, because all this assembly shall know that the Lord, again, saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. To the Israelites who saw the weaponry, who did not have the weaponry like the Philistines did, that's a very powerful statement that David makes. We don't have to have the equivalent weaponry to be successful in our endeavors. If God is on our side, we will be victorious. That's, again, we'll draw to a close with that verse, but that is a point of application that we always have to keep in mind. Some people think to themselves that they can continue to enjoy life. Life is worth living because they have a great bank account, they got a great house, they got really good connections in great social circles. That's what people rely on as a defense, in a way, of life. They think they're comfortable. They think they're protected in that. But there comes a point where death, maybe even in this life you lose all those things, but certainly at the point of death and on the day of judgment, none of that stuff is going to be able to protect you, right? None of that stuff's going to amount to anything. At the end of the day, if God is on your side, that's what's going to matter. Not maybe in this life you see the results of it, but certainly in eternity you see the results of relying on the help of God. David certainly understood that the temporal or the immediate benefits of relying on God's help, as we'll see next week when David will kill Goliath the Philistine. But we're going to go ahead and stop there for